No higher honor. Ladies and gentlemen, that's not only the title of the book that Dr. Condoleezza Rice recently wrote, it's also a no higher honor for me to have the privilege to introduce to you our 66th U.S. Secretary of State. Reading her book on the flight in from New York, it was struck that she was, for the 8 years that she was part of the Bush administration, first as the National Security Advisor and then the last 4 years as the Secretary of State, she was very quickly known as the crisis manager of the administration. She was pulled into meetings, whether it was domestic or overseas, for her perspective, her leadership, and her thoughts. I think everybody in this room, given her crisis management experience, will agree with me that that probably makes her a perfect candidate to run for office for the Indian Prime Ministership. I also know that Dr. Rice is a competitive golfer. Not only does she have a great golf mind of concentration, but her drive has all the direction and the distance. And I think those two traits made her the perfect candidate for being selected as and nominated as the Secretary of State. When I was asked by the USIBC to introduce Dr. Rice, I first thought I'll kind of read out her accolades, her accomplishments. But then I said, you have that in your handout. Let me just leave you with two thoughts. The first is probably a trivia that not many of you probably know out here, that she's the only Secretary of State that where a barbaric dictator had a crush on. And this is when Libya and the U.S., the relationships between Libya and the U.S. thawed. She was asked to go to Tripoli and meet with Muammar Gaddafi. And initially, after the first pleasantries and chats, she was shown a scrapbook which he had collected all her pictures over the years. So no matter what your political views of Muammar Gaddafi are, I must say that he had good taste. But on a more serious note, I think the one single thing that history will remember Dr. Rice for is the dehyphenation of the India-Pakistan relationship with the U.S. I think for centuries or for decades prior to that, the U.S. policy was always hyphenated between India and Pakistan. She worked tirelessly to dehyphenate that, which of course finally led to the civil nuclear deal and several billions of dollars in trade and investments over the years. So without further ado, let me introduce to you and welcome Dr. Condoleezza Rice, our 66th Secretary of State.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, the things one will do for one's country. That's the punchline to the Gaddafi story. Well, I'm delighted to join you here at the U.S.-India Business Summit West. Welcome to Palo Alto. You sit in the shadow of Stanford University, Silicon Valley, where, in fact, I think there are many opportunities to expand, continue, and press forward with those countries and those peoples who are fully exploiting the possibilities of human potential. And the United States is one of those places that has always been able to bring the most ambitious and the most risk-taking people here to be a part of the idea that it doesn't matter where you came from, it matters where you're going. And India is a place that I think that is emerging that is also a place that people feel the possibilities that human potential can bring, the energy, the creativity, the innovation. I'd like to spend just a few minutes talking about the international system, what it's gone through, the context that it provides now for thinking about the further enhancement of the U.S.-India relationship. And then I'd like to open up for questions, because questions or comments, because I'd like to make this more of a dialogue. When I do that, I'd like you to remember that I've been a professor again for the last 3 years, And if nobody raises your hand, I know how to call on people. So please think about what you'd like to talk about. Now, one way to think about the international system over the last decade or so is that we've actually been through 3 great shocks. And that's a lot in a period of a decade. First, of course, we had the shock of September 11th, which changed forever our concept of what constituted physical security. All of a sudden, we had to think, those of us who were in a position of authority on that day, about every day after being September 12th, every day after worrying that there was going to be another attack. Suddenly, it was not the powerful state that seemed to be a threat to the United States, this most powerful of states in the international system, but a group of stateless terrorists who came over from a failed state called Afghanistan and brought down the Twin Towers, blew a hole in the Pentagon, caused a plane to be driven into the ground in Pennsylvania, the worst attack on American soil since the War of 1812. And all of a sudden, our discussion about physical security was about homeland security, and it was about ungoverned spaces like the territory between Afghanistan and Pakistan, or Somalia, or Yemen. All of a sudden, the failed state was a greater threat than the strong state to our security. And from that point on, your concept of physical security is never quite the same. And then we had, of course, the second big shock, the global financial and economic crisis of 2008. And from that crisis, we saw a rethinking about what constituted economic security and prosperity. And especially here in the United States, where I think people don't recognize fully the psychological impact of Americans seeing the value of their homes drop to half, or perhaps the value of a home where you now owe more than you actually the home is worth. Because for Americans, homes were not just a place that you lived. They were the symbol of having somehow achieved the American dream. They were at the core of your belief that you were going to be okay. I can remember my grandfather telling my mother, Angelina, you buy a house as soon as you can, because the value of your house, that's never going to go down. So imagine what that meant. And of course, the shockwaves were not just here in the United States, but they were across the world. As we watched the impact on places like Europe, where in the Eurozone crisis, we are seeing the exposure of the fatal flaw in the European Union, that you really can't have a single monetary union without coordinated fiscal policies. And coordinated fiscal policies actually really require integrated political structures, which of course the European Union does not have. And the tensions in the European Union were kind of revealed in a headline that was in a German newspaper that said that perhaps the Greeks should sell the Acropolis to pay their debt. Now, a Greek headline responded by saying that if the Germans would like the Acropolis, perhaps they should come and get it. A not very happy reference to Germany's past. And so you see in places like Europe the impact of this great financial crisis. You see what happens when a country fails to diversify its economy, as Russia did. Russia, of course, which is always included in the BRICS. Well, I refer to them as the BICS because, of course, Russia is actually not an emerging economy. It's an oil and gas syndicate. It is with 85% of its exports in oil, gas, and minerals, and with political power, state power, a little bit of political violence, a lot of personal fortunes tied up in what comes out of the ground. The Russian economy is hardly one that one can call emerging. And the Russians have been trying to find a different profile. So Dmitry Medvedev actually visited here in Palo Alto a little over a year ago. And he was talking about how the knowledge-based economy should be a natural for Russia. He said, because we have the best software engineers and the best mathematicians in the world. And I had to hold my tongue because I wanted to say yes, but the problem is they're all working in Palo Alto and Tel Aviv. And so the Russian economy is hardly an emerging economy. But as you well know, and apropos to our story today, Brazil and India emerged from this crisis somewhat better. Because, of course, not only did they have conservative banking policies and prospects for continued growth, and did they have considerable reserves, But they emerged stronger. But I would suggest after now some 3, almost 4 years, not as strong as they might have because of constraints internally in the structure of the economies. The inability to really attract foreign investment in the way that they might because of continuing concerns about national policies that favor national champions, or because of bureaucracy or regulation, and so somehow not quite as much of an engine for the international economy as they might have been. And of course also significant problems in terms of income distribution. After all, as you well know, India is Bangalore and Mumbai, but it's also Calcutta, and Brazil is Sao Paulo, and it is Rio, but it's also the hills above Rio. And so the question of how much these economies can fully tap their human potential. But both Brazil and India have something going for them that shouldn't be underestimated. They are strong, multi-ethnic democracies, and they're stable democracies. And that relates to the third great shock, which is the Arab Spring, and what is going on in the streets of the Middle East, where we are learning yet again that authoritarianism is indeed not stable. Because if people don't have a way to change their circumstances peacefully, they will do so violently. And in the Middle East, you're seeing what happens when reform comes too late and you have instead revolution. Now, there's a story that I'm fond of telling that I learned when I was in Romania, and the Romanians tell the story of the dictator Nicolae Ceausescu, and it's 1989, and there are revolutions in Hungary and Poland and Czechoslovakia, and Ceausescu goes into a square to exhort the Romanian people about what he has done for them. There are 250,000 people in this square, and all of a sudden one old lady yells liar. Then 10, then 1,000. Now 100,000 people are yelling liar. And Ceausescu, realizing that something's gone wrong, turns to run, but of course the young military officer who's supposed to deliver him to freedom delivers him instead to the revolution. He and his wife are executed. The Ceausescu moment is when what stands between a dictator and his people, fear, breaks down. Either an old woman will yell liar, or a policeman will not fire on the crowd, or a soldier will not fire on the protesters, and all of a sudden the only thing that stands between the dictator and his people is anger. And that's a terrible way to make political reform. So places, countries that have systems, democratic systems, that in a place like India, where 1 billion people don't all speak the same language, don't all worship the same God, but somehow manage to change their governments peacefully, that is something that cannot be underestimated as a head start on life. And so when I look at these great shocks, and you see the shock of terrorism and physical security, you see the shock of the global financial and economic crisis, and you see what happens when people are denied a democratic path toward change, you see the strengths of a place like India in a very different light as we move to what is sure to be a reordering of the international power structure after these great shocks. And what is indeed comforting to me is that while there are a lot of questions about how strong America will be in this reordering, the ability of the United States to make league, to make common cause with other countries that have, in a sense, the same profile as we face these great shocks, is something that multiplies the capacity of the United States to continue to lead. The United States has, after all had a view, at least since World War II, that it is free markets and free peoples that are the future for prosperity in the world. And making common cause with others who believe in free markets and especially free peoples multiplies several times over the ability of the United States and allies to shape the international environment after these three great shocks. Now, I said that the United States and India share a number of things in common. And let me go back now to that first great shock. Because you might think, well, what could we possibly share in common there? Well, I would suggest that out of the terrible times of 2001, really all the way out through the most recent bombings in Mumbai, we together learned that this threat of stateless terrorism, those who will kill innocents in their political cause, is indeed a unifying moment for those of us who are on the decent side of history. I saw this very much when I went to Mumbai in November of 2008 after the bombings there. I went to India first, and when I landed there, I went to Prime Minister Singh's living room, to his home. And I walked in, and the then National Security Advisor, M.K. Narayanan, greeted me. And I could see in M.K.'s eyes the same look that I had seen in the mirror on September 12th. It's as if somehow every day after is a day of threat. Every day after is a day when something might pop out of a door and attack again. It is a sense that somehow you didn't quite do enough to protect your people, and it was your responsibility to do so. And it makes you absolutely determined not to do it, not to have it done again. But I saw something else too. I had managed the crisis between India and Pakistan in 2001 after the bomb at the Parliament. I had managed the India-Pakistan crisis in June of 2002. But this time, because the United States and India had developed a relationship of trust, I felt that we had a common knowledge and a common vocabulary about how to deal with a terrorist threat of this kind. That you have to get the states in which terrorists are harbored to own up to it and to do something about it. And so my conversation with Pakistan when I left India that day was very much different than it had been in 2001, 2002. It was simply, trust me, India does not want war. What India wants is Pakistan to respond to the threat that has grown within Pakistan to India's people and to India's interest. And oh, by the way, it's not just India's people and India's interest. It's the interest of the global community that are at risk here. And so I believe that over this decade, we've come to understand this threat as a common one. It is no longer India fighting terrorists. It is no longer the United States fighting terrorists or Russians fighting terrorists. It's a global threat to civilization, to prosperity, and to a modern way forward. And that's given us a solid foundation to think about our security together and differently. But the most important element of going forward is that we share this common set of values about the importance of free peoples and of democratic institutions. I remind people that India was actually the first country to contribute to the United Nations Democracy Fund to try and help states to move toward democracy. India is a wonderful example of what democratic institutions can do, because in a country with an enormous Muslim population, this is not a population that is somehow aggrieved and alienated, because it has institutions to which to appeal. And so as we go to try to help those who are trying to find their way toward the institutionalization of freedom, which they may have seized, into democratic institutions, it is extremely important that all of us who have made that journey work together with those who are still making that journey. Lest you think the institutions don't matter, remember the experience even of the United States here at home. I was a little girl in Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham, Alabama was the biggest segregated city in America. It was a city in which my family could not go into a restaurant could not go to a movie theater, could not stay in a hotel. And yet, when Martin Luther King challenged segregation in my hometown of Birmingham in 1963 and ultimately overcame it in 1964, he didn't have to say that the United States of America had to be something else. He had to say that the United States of America had to be what it said it was. Constitutions, institutions matter. The rule of law matters. If people believe that they have institutions to which to appeal, they will over time begin to trust them, and little by little, what is on paper will gain substantive meaning. So whether it is the people of the Middle East or the people next door in a very important neighborhood called South Asia or Southeast Asia or Southwest Asia, or a country called Afghanistan, a place where a lot of America's troubles started a decade ago, there are people who are seeking a way to institutionalize their freedom. And each and every one of us who has the great fortune to live on the right side of history, to say what we think, to worship as we please, to be free from the knock of the secret police at night, to be free of the arbitrary power of the state, and most importantly, to insist that those who would govern us have to ask for our consent. Those of us who have those rights have an obligation, a moral obligation, to advocate for those who do not. But we have a practical reason for doing it too. Because since authoritarianism is not stable and is not coming back, the only alternative to democratic consolidation is chaos. And we know where that would lead. The United States needs partners who believe in that set of values. India is one of those partners. And I hope that it is just the beginning of all that we can do together as this world rearranges itself in terms of security, in terms of economic progress and human potential, and in terms of the forward march of free peoples. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, are there some questions? Yes, over in the corner here. Mike is coming. Mike is coming. Here. Good.
Yeah, my question is that India and Pakistan has been going at each other since 60 years, and it's been U.S. policy which is sort of, from Indian standpoint, it was tilted towards Pakistan, and I believe maybe it's the other way around from the Pakistani side. What is new going to happen from the U.S. policy in future?
Yeah. Well, let me first say where I think this conflict is over Kashmir. And I'll be perhaps more black and white about this than one might be if one had to be a diplomat about it, which I don't have to be anymore. I think that this is a conflict that has outlived its usefulness for both sides. And all that it does now is it retards the inevitable evolution of the region toward one that is more prosperous and more stable. It's remarkable. India has sort of gone ahead and is doing the prosperity and stability side of it. I told the Pakistanis at one point, I said, look, the Indians really don't want to fight you. All right? They really don't. They want to do Bangalore and Bollywood and be part of the Security Council. Now, I do think that there are, unfortunately, in Pakistan, some elements, not at the top of the government, not in the general population, but some elements in the security forces for whom this remains a kind of existential talisman against decline. And if Pakistan can let go of that and concentrate on what the real security threat to Pakistan is, which is the terrorist threat, which is, after all, not just a threat to India, not just a threat to the United States, not just a threat to Afghanistan, but an existential threat to Pakistan. If they are willing now to recognize that training the army away from Kashmir and toward counterterrorism is really the future for their army, I think that you will have taken the last blood out of this conflict. And so what we try to do is not so much to broker. The United States is really never going to be in a position where either side, I think, will welcome the United States as a broker in the Kashmir crisis. But what we did try to do was to encourage the two sides to make as many steps forward as possible, confidence-building measures, whatever you want to call them, because there are some very good and solid ideas on how this gets. We basically know what the line is going to look like. We basically know what the governance structure is going to look like. And so encouraging the two sides to get there, I'm hopeful that as Pakistan, the Pakistani situation, their civilian government's not very strong, but frankly, it's stronger than I thought it might be. And so perhaps this is something that in time they can take up. In the meantime, to try to keep the temperature low is, I think, the most important thing from the American point of view. Yes. Mac is behind you.
Almost since World War II, global power structures are changing for almost the first time. The fissures are evident. Europe is becoming much weaker. I'm curious about what you see about 10 years from now or 20 years from now. What is the shape of the global power structure look like?
Yes. Well, there's no doubt that the global power structure is changing dramatically. I mean, you have only to look at, for instance, let's look at the G8. Right? Who talks about the G8 anymore? It was once the 7 largest economies, and then I was actually around when the Soviet Union sort of invited itself, and then it fell apart and it became Russia, and now with an economy that's sort of the size of the Netherlands, depending on the price of oil, it's part of the G8, but China isn't, India isn't, Brazil isn't. And so I've always said that international institutions are like a little bit like the rings of a tree. You can tell when they were born by who's in them. So I think you will start to see institutionally greater involvement of what we've called the BRICS of the Brazilian. That's why the G20, I think, is a more attractive institution for dealing with the global financial crisis. But I tell my students all the time, an interesting analytic question is, what will the world look like? An interesting policy question is, what do we do to make the world look like we want it to look? And I am unapologetic in saying that I want it to look like a balance of power that favors freedom. That means I want the most powerful states within the international system, the ones that are, in a sense, writing the rules, imprinting, to be those that believe in free markets and free peoples. Now, how do I do that? Well, first of all, I make certain that they're internally strong, which is why growth in India, institutional development in India, growth in Brazil, institutional development in Brazil, whatever we can do to help Europe straighten itself out. Heaven knows it would help if Japan were up off the mat. What South Korea is able to do. You have a network of awfully powerful democratic governments that have strong economies, and more of that is important. Secondly, I think you can strengthen that prospect through freeing trade. I was very saddened that the Doha round collapsed, and it seems to me that one of the answers to the growth deficit in a number of places, for instance in Europe even, is to see if there is more that you can do through the free trading system to increase the circulatory system, which then we know increases export and increases growth and so forth. And so that's another piece of making this world as we would like it to be. And third, it comes to the question of what then of the rising China, which, if anything, is the one challenge to the notion that authoritarianism isn't stable. But I think if you actually look at what's going on in China, you see a China that is an economic miracle, but is beginning to exhibit the stresses and strains of what happens when you have rapid social and economic change within very rigid political structures. You get Bourgeoisie, you get the bullet trains dropping off the tracks, you get labor unrest, because after all, the Chinese government has bet on legitimacy based on prosperity. The problem with legitimacy based on prosperity is people's expectations keep growing, and can you keep up? You get a demographic bow wave coming at you, because what seemed like a really brilliant idea at the time for population control, a one China policy, has now slowed the population situation in China, the demographics, to a point that they're about to, more rapidly than anybody else, meet that crossover point. And oh, by the way, if you lived in rural China and you only got to have one child, you wanted a boy. And so a lot of girls disappeared, and now 38 million Chinese men don't have mates. So China is straining and under all of this. And so I don't see China as necessarily a threat to this balance of power that favors freedom, as long as we don't cede the ground by not growing our own economies in the United States, by not dealing with our own deficits and money we can't afford to borrow and entitlements that we can't quite afford. If we don't cede the ground, then I think we have more of enough infrastructure to accommodate a rising China, to influence a rising China toward a different future for China, and to make certain that the states that determine the imprint on the international system are those that believe in a balance of power that favors freedom. And so active policy, I think, will create a different world in 20 years than if we sit back and let events go as they are going. All the way in the back, I think.
Atul Singh from Fair Observer. You talked about balance of power, and I'll take Dr. Rajiv Kumar's point, which he made earlier in the morning, about balance of power within Pakistan. As you have balance of power between different states, you have balance of power within societies and political states. In Pakistan, the army traditionally, until today, has an asymmetric hold on society and the power structures. The US has been funding Pakistani military for a while, and Dr. Kumar's point was that the only way to make a line smaller is by drawing a longer line under it. This was said by a wit in Emperor Akbar's court named Birbal. And so the point that he had was the US has to support civil society and democratic institutions and no longer give any financial or other aid to Pakistani military in order for the very institutions that you desire to become stronger and for Pakistan to become a more stable, democratic society. My question is the US willing to do that?
Yeah. Well, very often, I think you can tell I'm an advocate for an American policy that presses for freedom around the world. But the United States is not an NGO. All right, we're not a human rights organization. We are a big, powerful country that sometimes has competing interests. And our long-term interest is most certainly to have a stable, democratic Pakistan with a variety of civil society institutions that can check the power of the army. And I actually think in Pakistan you're getting that. If you look at the role of the judiciary, which has had sometimes negative impacts, but it's pretty independent in Pakistan. You look at the press in Pakistan. It is a far freer press in Pakistan than it was in 2001, 2002. You look at the fact that the civilian government actually has survived quite a bit of turmoil. And you look at the fact that I don't think that the army, I know the army head, the chief of the army, they don't seem to me to be men on horseback who really want back in power in Pakistan. And so if the external environment allows a period in which you don't have events that drive the army back into power, I think you may continue to see the development of civil society in Pakistan in a fairly healthy way. But it's going to take a long time, and it's going to be bumpy, and there will be a lot of ups and downs to it. The United States actually does give did under us and does under the Obama administration give a lot of money to other aspects of Pakistani society, civil society, education, etc. We were the biggest advocates for the Pakistani economy with the IMF and with the Asian Development Bank and so forth. So it's not simply a military policy. But you don't have an option to withdraw aid from the Pakistani military. Because unless the United States military wants to fight in the northwest frontier, which I don't think we do, you've got to have some kind of presence there with the Pakistani army. And what we've been trying to do with our aid, we tried to do, the Obama administration has tried to do, is to train the Pakistani army, help them train to do that job instead of worrying about Kashmir. Look, it's a very unsatisfying policy. It is absolutely the case that one of the most unsatisfying policies is dealing with a state that is as volatile as Pakistan. But you don't have an option to just do one or the other. And so very often the policies of the United States will have both an aspect of continuing to sustain military assistance and trying to direct it in ways that are more in line with our interest, and trying to help the Pakistani civil society grow at the same time. Yes.
Madam Secretary, could I perhaps ask the last question as a way to help wrap this up and maybe go back to some fond memories here, and that is a simple grace. I remember when Deputy Prime Minister L.K. Advani visited the White House, and he was there to visit with you, actually, and the President George W. Bush, stopped by for a long, very informal and very cordial drop-by. And I know that in India that sent very, very positive shockwaves. We all remember here in this room on July 18th, 2005, the kind of excitement that happened in Washington the day the Prime Minister visited Washington, D.C. I remember going to the lunch at the Secretary of State's office, your upstairs room there, extraordinary lunch, and Jayashankar said, "Ron, something big is going to happen. I can't tell you what it is, but it's going to be big, and either I'm going to be walking a mile off the ground or I'm going to be drunk in my soup tonight." And that evening we saw in 4-inch headlines, U.S.-India civil nuclear cooperation. One other happy moment, the trip of you and Nick Burns and Anya Manuel and George W. Bush, the 5th ever president visiting India in March 26, 2006, if I'm not mistaken. That was the separation agreement. And the rest is history. 359 to 68 in the House of Representatives, 85 to 12. I don't think our U.S. Congress has ever been that bipartisan ever since, but it was a unanimous vote in a deeper, for deeper cooperation between the United States and India. Can you share with us any of your happy memories of that extraordinary historic event? And then how would you like to see that now come out, given where we are, two great democracies that can shape the destiny of the 21st century, such a major issue where the Ambassador Frank Wisner would have said the cinder that day was removed from the eye in the U.S.-India relationship, and it was your administration that did that. Yes. Where do we take it, and how can the U.S.-India Business Council help make that happen?
Well, there are a couple of important ambassadors here. I didn't see my good friend over there, but Frank and Ambassador Romer. This is actually a great story. We were talking about it. I was talking about it earlier with some people. I'll come to the Bush administration, but of course, the United States and India had been trying to move toward one another in the Clinton administration. You know, there was a long history of the non-aligned movement having a kind of anti-U.S. edge. There was the courtship with the Soviet Union. There was the hyphenating of the Indo-Pak relationship, which I think offended, frankly, both states when it came right down to it. And I remember one of my very earliest conversations with then Governor George W. Bush. And we were talking about what some of the initiatives might be in his foreign policy should he be elected. And he had some ideas about Mexico and Latin America, not surprisingly. He had some ideas about missile defense, not surprisingly. And then he said, you know, I'd really like to see if we couldn't do more with India. And I said, well, where does that come from? And it was because he knew the diaspora in Austin so well. And he knew the energy and the innovation and the love for democracy and the tremendous contribution that people of Indian descent were making here in America. And so we really started to do some thinking about what we could do. And 9/11, in a sort of strange sort of way, as I said, brought us a little bit closer because we suddenly understood we had a common problem with terrorism. It wasn't just an Indian problem. We also had a common problem. And then we started thinking about how could we do a civil nuclear deal. And I remember saying to the president, I said, you know, Mr. President, if we go down this road, the ayatollahs of non-proliferation are going to be all over us. Are you ready for the idea that you are unraveling the entire non-proliferation regime by doing this with India? And he said, I'm ready, are you? He said, that's the world you come from, because I'd been an arms control specialist and so forth. And so we began slowly but surely to work step by step because we recognized that this was actually not just about civil nuclear. Because of the way that the nuclear test had been done and the web then of constraints and laws and regulations that had been put and piled on, really it wasn't just nuclear technology that was impossible with India. It was a whole range of high technology. And so you had these two democracies, both of which were making tremendous strides in technology, and they couldn't cooperate because of all of these constraints. And it was then, in 2003, that we decided that we were going to try to work toward a civil nuclear deal. Now, I could tell you the stories of the late nights and the almost missed opportunities and the days when I never thought it would get done. And I'll tell you one, and then I'll go on to the happy ending. So just before that July meeting that you mentioned, I had worked the the day before with Natwar Singh, who at the time was my counterpart as foreign minister. And he said, I'll take it to the prime minister. He said, you know, it's going to be very rough on him in Delhi because there will be many who object to what they will see as an attack on Indian sovereignty, so forth and so on. He said, but I'll take it to them. So late that night, Nick Burns called me and he said, it's not going to happen. And I said, what? And he said, the Indians just called, and the prime minister doesn't think that he can get it done back in Delhi. And so I went to bed. I said some things about, well, if they want it that way, you know how you react. If they want it that way, that's just fine, blah, 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 so forth and so on. And then I went to bed. And I woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning, straight up, and I said, I am not going to let this deal go down. And I called Nick Burns, and I said, ask if I can see the prime minister. And he said, the prime minister doesn't want to see you. And I said, why? He said, he doesn't want to have to tell you no. He respects you. He doesn't want to have to tell you no. I said, ask again. I want to see the prime minister. And we sat there, and we talked, and we worked it through, and then we went to the White House, and the president and the prime minister sat there in the Oval Office pretending to have conversation about something else while the diplomats were trying to work out the last language. They were both incredibly nervous about whether this was going to get done. And Nick Burns, you never burst into the Oval Office, never. Nick Burns burst into the Oval Office and he said, we have it! And that was the moment at which I thought, you know, we are going to be able to propel this relationship to another level. And then visiting in 2006, I suddenly had a very strong sense of why it was so important. Because yes, it was a civil nuclear deal, and yes, it was the fact that we were allies in the war on terror, and yes, this was a powerful place with economic development, and we talked about the green revolution that we had helped India with in the 50s, and now the next phase of that. But I went out to a couple of universities, and I could have been at Stanford University. And all of a sudden, I met these young Indians who were in technology fields and MBAs, and I thought to myself, this is why. This is why it is really important that the United States and India, these two great multi-ethnic democracies, get over whatever that past was and move forward in the future. That night, we were invited to a beautiful dinner at the presidential palace looking out over the beautiful gardens, and it was a warm summer night. I said to the Prime Minister as we were standing there, "Well, Prime Minister, it seems we are going to get it done." And he said, "Yes, I think we're going to get it done." And he said, "The future will be bright for India, and the future will be bright for the United States. And it's awfully good that we can do it together." And I thought, this is a wonderful moment, and it's one of the proudest moments that I had as Secretary. Thank you.